Hey, AP students, it's snow day today, and on Friday I'm gone, but you'll have a Thursday schedule, so you're going to be here for a whole block period. It's crunch time, and that means that you need to learn a lot in a few days. I'm not there today, but you're going to watch this video and hopefully learn one of the hardest topics, which is not ideal with a video. However, the one way it will work quite well is that because there's video of it, this can be posted and you can just watch it again a couple times to catch some of the details as you study for your exam and for the AP exam in May. So we're going to maybe review just briefly the congressional setup, and then we're going to talk about the budget process, and that means I'm going to be floating to the back over here. There's a concept, kind of web concept that you can see. You're going to be looking, you're going to have a worksheet that's going to be the equivalent to what's projected up here. I might write some notes on it. You may pause this video at times to write things down if you need to. And then we're going to relay it back to what you know about the House and Senate to kind of wrap up understanding of budget. And then Mr. Steinbacher is going to talk you through some graphs and ways to see the budget in graph, in some sort of visual way, and maybe ask some really good questions as well. Then near the end, you might do a Kahoot on the powers of Congress. It is Mr. Steinbacher's last day, so the treats hopefully will be particularly good to celebrate his time with us. So just a reminder, and we're going to come back to this later, we talked about the structure of Congress, and this is something that you need to know. Hopefully you wrote this down or snapped a picture of it. But we have the House and the Senate, we have leadership within it, and we have the committees underneath. And these standing committees are going to play a bit into this. I didn't write this up here, but again, the House has the power of the purse, which is where all budgeting starts. Okay, Senate partakes in it too. But remember, their role is primarily advise and consent, which we had talked about before. So, but before we do this all, I am going to have you take out, I'm looking here for my documents that I want, and I don't see them right now, but you are going to take out this worksheet, okay? And we're going to talk about it in a minute, but you are going to flip it over. And on the back side, you are going to write this this kind of web concept, okay? And you guys can pause it now, or you can just look back here because I'm hoping that this doesn't get erased and it's here tomorrow morning. And in fact, I'll be here before school and I'll talk it through. But you're going to draw this. And I'm going to talk you through it because this is kind of, again, all the big concepts that we're going to talk about as it relates to our national budget. One of the things you do need to know is that our national budget is one of the toughest topics to understand. There's kind of 6 big topics, including selective incorporation and federalism, are some of the things that we've talked about. We haven't talked about iron triangles yet, but this is an incredibly hard thing to understand. And I don't want to overcomplicate it. I want to try to reduce it down and let's just keep it basic. So that you can understand it, and at the same time give you the details you need so that you have this framework in your mind to kind of like do it decently well. If you want to do more with the federal budget, it is chapter 13 in your book. And in chapter 13, although maybe it's 12, it just says the federal budget right off the top of my head. I know in one of the old books it was 12, and one of the new books it's 13, or vice versa. But if you want to read more on the details, you can do that. There may be some incredibly tricky multiple choice questions on there that kind of go beyond what I'm going to present today. But in general, what I want to give you is the main vocabulary. Okay, and also the main, flow of the budget. So by watching this video in class today, maybe reviewing it later, taking good notes, studying the notes later, practicing it with some multiple choice questions as you practice for your exam, you'll get that 90% of the federal budget. That's the most important, and that will, all but maybe a slimmer chance of a hard multiple choice question, you'll be able to do quite well on the budget section. Okay? So we have our national budget. That's the center of our circle. I just want to kind of highlight some things that we're going to see in a little bit. Okay, and here they are. So the national budget is like a bill. And you know, when you watch videos on how a bill becomes a law, I'm just a bill and things like that, that same process is involved here, where it has to go through Congress and pass through Congress. Then it has to be signed by the president. We're going to see that in a little bit. And so that process is what we're talking about broadly. We have to remember that. Okay. We also need to know, I'm going to kind of jump over here, but we need to know that our budget includes taxing, which a fancier word for it is revenue. When we tax, revenue comes into the government. Okay. And when the government spends, and those are called expenditures, then it goes back out to the people. Okay. So there's taxing and spending. Okay. What you need to know about taxing and spending is that most people love spending. They like to get things from the government. They don't like to give things from the government. Okay. And so from here, taxing and spending, we're going to go over here. Okay. Most years when we tax and spend, we tax less than we spend, or we spend more than we tax, because we like that. Okay. We like the idea of like getting things from the government, but not paying things to the government. Okay. Now, when that happens in 1 year, that is called a budget deficit. Okay. So if in a given year, let's say we spend $5 trillion and we take in $4 trillion, we in that year are spending a budget deficit of $1 trillion. In other words, there's $1 trillion that came in or that went out that didn't come in. Okay. And that is a budget deficit. Okay. By the way, that is not the same as a trade deficit. Okay. Sometimes we kind of confuse the two. Trade deficit is more about economics, although it's also about politics. But a budget deficit is a little bit more about politics than it is economics. It's about the fact that our government is going bankrupt long term, although it's very complicated more than that. But budget deficits, okay? Now, when you have a budget deficit, that's just for 1 year. That gets added to our national debt, okay? Now, just to give you an idea, our national debt is all our deficits every year over time. Okay. Right now, our national debt is $36 trillion. Okay. And this past year, our deficit was about $1 trillion. In other words, we added $1 trillion to our $36 trillion debt. Okay. And so that's where you kind of see how those terms work. Okay. Deficits and debts. And it comes back to taxes and spending. You're going to see some charts that kind of talk about that. Okay. Here's some other details about the budget process. Okay. The budget process, because it involves Congress passing a law, okay, it has to happen every year. Every year, Congress is supposed to come up with a new budget. Okay. And we're going to see that process, that flow over here. Okay. And maybe even with the hierarchy of Congress over there that we started the other day. Okay. But that it passes every year, and it's similar to other laws, but a little bit more complicated because it's big. And then the last thing I'd have to say, and we need to know this, is that in many years, there is no budget passed because the Republicans and Democrats can't agree. And so what they then do is they pass something called a continuing resolution, where they basically say, well, let's take last year's budget because we can't agree. Let's just take last year's budget and continue using that. Okay. And now that you kind of have all of this here, and this is the big picture that you can kind of come back to, I do want to talk about flow. Okay. And flow is going to come through this document right here. I'm going to see if I can get a little bit better here. This will be projected on the wall too in a PowerPoint, but I'm going to do it here because then potentially I can draw on things. Okay. Now, and feel free to write as you feel fit, but we're following the flow here, and here's the beginning of the process up here. You can see I put a note that it starts 18 months before the budget actually begins. Okay, so it starts a long time before we actually have the budget, which is October 1. So already they're talking about 2026. Okay. And what they do now is there's kind of two organizations that work on it. Okay. Because you have, to use our policy making cycle over here, we have two groups involved in making our budget. We have the legislative branch and the executive branch, okay? So you have those two branches working on it, but they each have their offices that are working on it. And these are lots of accountants that are doing this. The president has something called the Office of Management and Budget. That is a term you need to know. Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, okay? And they, right now, the president, and even though they're a Democrat and there's a Republican coming in, there is a lot of coordination here. Obviously, some of the priorities are going to change between the Democrats and the Republicans, but a lot of the accountants working for the OMB are just like, well, we have a lot of things we have to pay for. We have to pay for the military, we have to pay for roads and bridges, we have to pay for all of these programs, and they're going to change a little between a Republican and Democrat, but not a ton, okay? And then you need to also know that Congress, because they're a different branch in the policy-making cycle, they have their own office of accountants that are putting things together, and that is called the CBO, or the Congressional Budget Office. And they almost do the same thing as the president's office in OMB. They come up with their own numbers, and they're constantly looking at funding levels and things like that. Okay? And so you have these two offices working independently, but they're kind of like checks for each other, where Congress is kind of saying, well, what can we pay for? Remember, power of the purse. And what do we need to fund? And the president's saying, well, what are my policy initiatives? What are the things that I want to be known for? And so then they work on that. Okay. And so as it's getting ready in March, actually it's February 15, I believe. In February 15, the president finally says, okay, in October our budget ends, and I want to start a new year, and he hands off his budget from the OMB to Congress, and that's the CBO. And they then get this list of like, okay, here's what we're hoping to fund. Okay, guarantee President Trump right now is trying to work on a tax cut. Okay, the problem with tax cuts is you got to cut spending too, and cutting spending is really hard. You're going to see that in a little while. Okay, and then the House needs to take that presidential budget and they need to figure out what they're going to do or how they're going to fund it, okay? And that's where we need to understand spending on two different levels, okay? And I want you to circle, I have a green pen here. I want you to circle mandatory and underline uncontrollable spending. I'm doing this left-handed, aren't you impressed? And then I want you to circle discretionary and underline controllable spending, okay? And that is huge because you can see two tracks here. There is a track for mandatory spending, okay, and there's a track for discretionary spending. The thing you need to know is that the biggest part of the budget, and you may want to write this down here, the biggest part of the budget is mandatory spending. And that is spending that we can't change, okay? These are promises we've made to people as a government that we can't take away. And that's going to be things like Social Security. We have promised your grandparents money. We just can't say, sorry, Grandma and Grandpa, we don't have money for you this year. Guess you're going to have to sleep in the snow. No, what we do is we say, okay, we're promising you this much, $1,300 a month, because you worked your whole life here and you've contributed to Social Security, you now get money. That is mandatory spending. So is Medicare, okay, which is health care for older people, okay? Other things that are mandatory spending is Medicaid. And Medicaid is funding that is given to people who are low income. Again, a promise that was made that we're not going to let you die of a preventable disease because you couldn't pay the hospital. So Medicaid is also mandatory spending. So is interest on our debt. We have to, when we borrow money, we promise to pay people back with interest. Okay, that's mandatory spending, and that is going to go through Congress, and there's very little that they can do, especially on a year-to-year basis. If we change those things, it's called entitlement. That's another term that you may want to write down, and because mandatory spending, a lot of it is entitlements. There are things that we're entitled to as U.S. citizens. But if we wanted to change entitlement spending, we can't just do it year to year. It would have to be a long change, okay, a big change that would be very significant. And so far, the U.S. government cannot or has not had the desire to change those things because it would be highly political for both Republicans and Democrats, okay? But that is mandatory spending. And basically, you can see Congress basically looks at this and takes it for information and just basically says, well, how much money do we have to raise to pay off all this stuff that we said we need to do? And in the case of Social Security, we already have that money. We actually have a pile of money, about $1 trillion, just sitting there waiting to be spent on Social Security right now. Okay, and so then that would pass through the House and Senate budget. And with their input, the budget committees prepare a reconciliation bill, a bill that says, hey, this is what we have for our entitlement. And by the way, everybody passes that. This is not controversial, okay, because it's things that we've promised. So mandatory spending, you will look at these in the graphs in a little while, but you definitely need to know that word, mandatory spending, okay? Now, here's where it gets a little bit more tricky. You have discretionary spending, okay? And that's where the budget gets kind of like, that's where we do get political, okay? Because discretionary spending is the spending we can change, and it's a much smaller portion of our budget, okay? But that would be things like defense. How much money are we going to spend on our military? That would be veterans. How much money can we give to veterans, okay, the people who have served? How much are we going to give for food stamps? How much are we going to give to farmers? Okay, how much are we going to give to public transportation? How much are we going to give to roads and bridges and infrastructure? Okay, and even though that sounds like a lot, it's actually it's a smaller part, and you'll see it in the graphs later. Okay, but and here's the process. Okay, when they first get it, they write something called a resolution. Okay, a budget resolution where they look at the spending levels and figure out, can we do this? Okay. And this is where I'm going to walk over here, okay? And then what happens in the discretionary spending is it first goes to a committee called the Appropriations Committee, okay? And they start to say, well, appropriations means spending, and they look at all the spending and all the revenue coming in, and they start to mark up what they can afford, what they can't afford, okay? And if we wanted to see it over here in the House, which is the power of the purse, one of these committees, an incredibly important committee, is called the Appropriations Committee. Okay, and then they set it up. And then what happens for discretionary spending is it goes to all these other committees. So for example, one of these committees might be the Defense Committee in charge of our military. And so then they say, well, how much money is going to go to our military? And maybe it's $700 billion or something like that. But we need to fund our military. There might be a Veterans Committee, Veterans Affairs Committee. Well, then they start to say, well, what can we, how much can we spend in our appropriations, from our Appropriations Committee, how much can we spend on veterans? Okay, and then there's Health and Human Services. How much can we spend on, helping people with low income afford food stamps? How much can we help on low income housing and things like that? So every one of these committees, well, actually it's not everyone, but many of these committees then get these spending bills, okay? And there's 13 of them, and they get these bills from the Appropriations Committee, where they look at it line by line and say, well, here's how much we can spend, okay? And that's where, if you watched the video yesterday from Khan Academy, they talk about earmarks and pork barrel spending. That's where these committees would start to put in things like, hey, if we're looking at a Veterans Affairs Committee, we want a new veterans facility in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Okay, or if we're looking at elderly care, we want a new senior citizen center in Reed City. Okay, and we also know that when we do that, we make the representative from Northern Michigan happy, because suddenly he can go back to his district and say, hey, we have $1 million for a new senior citizen center in Reed City, and that might help this bill pass. Okay, and so that's where you see some of that pork barrel spending. That's kind of lavish spending in some ways. And a lot of it just kind of helps things go through these committees, okay? And so these committees are all then looking at these, and they're passing these. Obviously, they have to compromise. They have to log roll, to use what we did the other day in class. They may have to log roll some of these issues through in these committees, okay? And at some point, what's also going to happen is they're going to pass them out, and they're going to come back to the full House, okay? And when they come back to the full House has to say, okay, well, this is our spending. We have until September 30, which is the end of the fiscal year, to get this ready. And when it comes back to the whole committee or to the whole House, they have to vote on these 13 bills separately. Okay? Now, here's a term that often happens. Okay? When they get these 13 bills, and you can see the word or the number 13 here, when they get those 13 bills, sometimes it's like, well, it's a pain to talk about them all separately. Let's cram them all together in what they call an omnibus bill. Okay? An omnibus bill. And when they do that, that's their way of saying, okay, we're going to put them all together, and we're going to give them a yes down or yes or no vote. And then we're going to, it just makes it easier. Instead of trying to deal with 13 bills separately, we're dealing with them all the same. We try to make everybody happy, and that's maybe the log rolling that you did the other day. And then once we're happy, we're going to pass it into law from not pass it into law. We're going to pass it from the House. Okay. It then is going to go to the Senate. It may go through some Senate committees as well. It's then going to be passed by the Senate. And if it passes the Senate, it's then going to go to the President, and the President is going to sign our budget for a new year. Okay? And this is where a couple of things can happen. Okay? The worst case scenario is if there's not a bill by October 1 and they're not in a compromising mood at all, you may see a government shutdown. Okay? And this has happened 4 or 5 times in the last few years, where Congress cannot come up with a bill and the president is feisty and saying, I'm not happy. And both sides kind of like decide, hey, let's shut down the government and try to make the other side look bad. Okay? And this is where the president says, I am not going to sign a bill. I think people will blame the Congress. Or this is where the Congress is like, hey, let's not pass a bill. And I think people are going to blame the president. Okay? And that's a government shutdown. That's where, like, the whole government doesn't shut down, but a lot of things do. You can't get passports. There's no, all the construction projects end. Some things that are important, like our military stay on duty and things like that, things that are considered essential. Okay? But there can be shutdowns at times. But that only has happened 4 or 5 times in the last 40 or 50 years. The more likely scenario is when all of this happens and they maybe have an omnibus bill or other things with the discretionary spending and they can't decide. Rather than shutting down or rather than passing a new bill or a new budget, they basically say, let's do a continuing resolution. Okay, let's just take last year's budget and project it out. Okay? So that, in a nutshell, is the process. You're going to look at some charts and graphs now. Maybe you're going to come up with good questions, and you can talk to me later. Mr. Steinbacher may be able to answer those as well. And also the charts and graphs may help that. One thing you do need to know, and there's one that we didn't talk about, and if you took economics last year and you're a senior, or there may be 1 or 2 juniors that took econ as well, you need to know that budgets can be used to influence the economy. Budgets, and that's called fiscal policy. Okay, and that's where the government says, hey, can we increase spending to try to jumpstart the economy? By the way, that's what happened during COVID. During COVID, we were worried about a depression, and so both parties were like, hey, let's flush money into the economy to make sure that we don't slip into a depression. Okay, and you'll see that in some of the charts and graphs you did as well. But that is called fiscal policy. There is another kind of policy too called monetary policy. I'm not going to talk about that in this video. So anyway, I hope I adequately did this, and we may go over it on Tuesday. See you later.